So we've been looking at the goals that economies have, and you have to choose because many of them conflict, although some of them do work together. But what are your top priorities? So we looked at the first goal, which was improve standard of living, and how do we measure that? We measure it with GNI per capita, Human Development Index, education rates, and poverty rates. Economic growth, and how do we measure that? Real GDP per capita. Then our third one, full employment. Okay, we measure that with the unemployment rate, and full employment is 4 to 6.4%. Stable prices, how do we measure that? That's the inflation rate. We measure that change in the prices of the consumer price index, that bundle of goods the typical consumer buys, and we try to keep inflation in Canada between 1 and 3%. We then have the balance of international trade. We measure that with imports and exports. We're looking at whether or not we have a trade surplus or a trade deficit. Is there more money coming in or more money going out of our country? Then we looked at the equitable distribution of income, that division between the rich and the poor. Does everyone make a similar amount of income, or is there great disparity in wealth? And you can measure that graphically with the Lorenz curve. And since it's hard to compare lots of graphs simultaneously, we turn it into numbers with the Gini coefficient. So right now we're looking at the last goal, which is manageable government debt and deficit. When we talk about manageable government debt and deficit, we're talking about the difference between revenue and expenses. Does the government spend more than it earns in revenue? Right, so we have a surplus. There's what often called a budget surplus. If the revenue, the money that we bring in, typically taxes, is greater than our expenses. Sure what happened here. Let's try that again. Whereas a deficit is when our revenue is less than our expenses. So how can we have a deficit? Well, governments can spend more money than they bring in tax revenue. And that is because they borrow money. Okay, they can borrow money by issuing bonds. That's essentially debt. And we invest in government bonds as ways to plan for our retirement, right? Because we're basically guaranteed money back by the government. Well, what you're really buying is government debt and an IOU that they'll pay you back later. So governments can finance deficit spending with bonds, with borrowing. They can borrow from other countries. They can. We also have the International Monetary Fund that lends money to countries that are having trouble getting money, or we can issue bonds to our own people. So we'll look in more detail about how governments finance their deficit spending later this semester. But we want to have a manageable level of deficit spending, because the problem is that if you have deficit spending year after year after year, it is debt. And debt means you owe somebody, and typically you have to pay them back. So what we want to do here is we want to look at where do we stand when it comes to deficit spending and debt. And we want to look at, is all debt bad? Should we be completely avoiding deficit and debt? Or is it okay to have some debt, some deficits? So we're looking at that balance of government spending and taxation. So first question is, where do we stand on that deficit spending or those budget surpluses? So let's start with Alberta. Does Alberta have a budget surplus or a budget deficit? Well, here we have the 2020-21 update, and this came out just at the end of August 2020. And so it reflects some of the spending that the provincial government of Alberta has done related to COVID. So you can see here total revenue of 38 billion, and you can see total expenses of 62.6 billion. So right now for the 2020-21, as of the end of August 2020, they are forecasting to have a budget deficit of $24 billion. And the reason they gave this August update is because that is a higher deficit than they had originally forecast, and they're updating it with what has happened over the summer with the COVID-19 pandemic. So the Alberta government is forecasting a budget deficit for this year. And we can look at the federal government as well. And in fact, I'll provide a link to this update because it has lots of interesting information related to what we've been talking about. It shows what's happening with unemployment and jobs. And so it gives you a lot of information related to the goals that we've been discussing in these videos. So we want to focus here is on this budgetary balance. So you'll notice here, and I'll just move my face so we can see. But we can see for 2020-21 that they are forecasting a deficit, a budget deficit of $343 billion. Let's compare that to the previous year, 2019-2020. They also had a budget deficit, and that was of $34 billion. So you can see the impact of government spending, right? Fiscal policy to help stimulate the economy during COVID-19 pandemic and to help people during this time has actually caused that deficit spending to increase substantially, right? From $34 billion to $343 billion deficit in that year. Well, how do we compare to other countries? Well, we have to go back to a little bit older data to do a bit of a comparison. But here you have on the right the surplus deficit as a percentage of GDP for 2017. And you can see that we had a deficit there about 1% of our gross domestic product. And if we go back, what they're reporting here in this document is that the budget deficit for 2020-21 would be close to 16% of gross domestic product, whereas in previous years, we've been looking at about 1% of GDP. So you can see in 2017 how we compare to other countries. Those who have a lot of upheaval, turmoil are going to have quite big deficits. You see Afghanistan, Venezuela there. Check out the videos about what's happening in Venezuela. But if people aren't paying taxes, if you're not collecting any revenue, then you're going to have a deficit. If you're in a recession or a depression, so people don't have jobs, they're not paying taxes, you have less revenue, higher expenses, you're more likely to be deficit spending. So you can see for most countries, they're trying to balance their budgets. So we're really hovering around that zero, either a little bit on the positive or a little bit on the negative. And then we have some examples of countries that do have a budget surplus. They're bringing in lots of revenue. And some of these countries have been ones that historically have had, a lot of oil production, things like that, that made the countries a lot of money. They had a lot of investments as a country that were doing really well. But there are countries that had heavy investment in oil, and so their revenues from the sale of those natural resources have declined that ability to have that budget surplus. You can see here, this is from 2010, and this shows the debt. So what happens is your deficits, when you can't pay and you spend more than you make in revenue, you have a deficit, and those deficits year after year accumulate and become debt. So when we look at gross debt, okay, so we have to consider the difference between gross debt and net debt. So gross debt, we look at the total amount that is owed, and it can be reported at a federal level. So it can be just the national government's debt. It can be gross debt or public debt for all of your country, which is then your municipal government, your provincial or state government, your national government, so everybody. Okay, we can look at it in those different ways. When we look at Canada, for example, This is Canada's federal debt. So here's our debt clock. This is just the federal government. It does not include the provincial and municipal governments. So when we look at the government's debt here, we have $863 billion in federal debt. And if we divide that by the population, your portion's about $23,000. That is just the federal government. There is debt that the provinces and the cities have as well. When we look at the US debt, so you can see in the debt clock here, their debt is, what do we have? Thousand, million, billion, trillion, $26.7 trillion in debt. And this is not just the federal, but this is state, municipal, all the debt combined. So you really have to look at how they're calculating debt. And you can dive in. There's a link to this and look in more detail at all these numbers on this clock. And we could see here with the federal debt, this is Canada. And my face is blocking the view here, so let's go back. The federal debt as a percentage of GDP, so just the federal government for Canada, in 2020-21 is 49%. So the total gross debt in Canada is about 89% pre-COVID, and then that was with federal debt sitting around that 30% mark, and now you can see that extra 20% of federal debt as a percentage of GDP really has a lot to do with expenses related to COVID. Comparison, the U.S.'s gross debt in 2019, we said ours was about 89% of GDP, of the total value of everything we make. And in the U.S., it's about 107%. So let's go back to our charts here. So net debt in comparison is what happens when you take everything that we owe in debt and subtract assets. So businesses own assets, right? You can sell your building, your machines. Governments own assets as well. So they might own an airport, a museum, the postal service. They can liquidate these assets to help pay down the debt. So sometimes you see the debt written as net debt, and you'll notice that's a much smaller percentage, and that's because they are looking at what if we liquidated all the assets. And in fact, some countries are liquidating assets. So California a couple years ago had quite a lot of debt, and one thing they did was they took some state parks and privatized them. And in fact, Alberta is looking at doing the same thing, taking some provincial parks and selling that land as well. So that would then reduce their debt because you take how much you owe minus the sale of that asset, right? If we look at Greece, Greece was having a really hard time during that 2008-2009 recession and in the years after that. So the challenge they had is that with their deficit spending, they had huge deficit spending, and then the one who lent them money was German banks. And so because it was foreign-owned individuals, banks and individuals who were the ones actually lending them money, well, that money came due, and Greece didn't have it. So they had sold and privatized ports, where you have your boats. They privatized some museums and airports, and selling these off and then using that to help pay off the debt. The reason I want to show you this graph here is that this looks at the public or gross debt, and we looked at the fact that, let's just put these numbers up, 2019 US 107%, Canada 89%, just to kind of give you a picture of how countries compare. And the reason we're showing you a graph here of Europe is because the European Union actually requires that you don't have too much debt in order to join the European Union. So European Union collective group, they have a single currency. So they are doing monetary policy together. Well, the problem is that if we print lots of money, it impacts inflation, and we use monetary policy to help stimulate economies or slow them down. Well, The problem is that in the European Union, it's lots of different countries that have different economies. Well, when countries spend more than they bring in revenue, so they deficit spending turns into debt, this can impact inflation, this can impact the economy. We're going to talk about all this in detail this semester. And that becomes problematic because those steps can be very counter to what you're trying to do with your monetary policy and your money. So the European Union essentially says if you want to join the European Union, you can't have a gross debt more than 90% of GDP. So what I want to point out to you here in this graph is that there are many countries that don't meet that requirement. So the US couldn't join the European Union. Canada's really close to not being able to join the European Union if we wanted to. And in fact, if we go back to 2008, all the countries that were in the European Union did not meet the criteria to be in the European Union. So the European Union says your deficit, that was what we saw here, can't be more than 3%. And your debt can't be more than 90% of GDP in order to join. And so that restriction is really so that the monetary policy isn't creating more problems for other countries based on what you're doing with the rest of your economy because you have debt that's creating other problems. But at the same time, it's creating an issue because all the members of the European Union don't actually meet the criteria to be in the European Union. There's one last thing we want to talk about, which is what if we have deficits and we have debt? So what we're hearing from Alberta is they need to figure out how to cut costs so that they can fix the deficit, stop deficit spending. Many provinces and states have a balanced budget requirement. They're not allowed to have deficit spending. They can have votes that allow kind of a temporary extension on a deficit, but then they have to pay it back. Federal governments can have deficits. They can have debt. There's problems that are created if there's too much debt. But should we not have any debt or deficits at all? It really depends on whether your debt is structural or cyclical. Cyclical debt says we spend more than we make in the bad times. So during the recessions, during the COVID pandemic, we're going to have government spending be more than tax revenue. Okay, we're going to deficit spend. Cyclical debt says in the good times, you pay it back. So it's okay to deficit spend as long as when the economy is growing, then you have less government spending than your tax revenue and you pay off that debt. Structural debt, on the other hand, is when you spend more than you make in the bad times and the good times. So the government spending is more than the tax revenue all the time. So this debt just keeps accumulating. And there are downsides to having too much debt. That's kind of the challenge that countries like Argentina, Zimbabwe, Venezuela have gotten into. We're going to look at the risks associated with structural debt. It impacts your exchange rate, impacts your economic growth, your jobs, it impacts prices. There's this downward spiral that's created if you just keep accumulating more and more debt because there's no good solutions to get out. It just keeps getting worse. Whereas cyclical debt, we recognize that you're not always going to have enough government and enough tax revenue for government spending. Because during recessions, people lose jobs, they have less income, they'll pay less taxes. And so tax revenue will fall. You also might want to use fiscal policy to stimulate the economy, so government spending will go up. So it makes sense that you're probably going to have deficits at some point in order to keep the economy going. The question is when times are better, do you pay it back? And that's the big question in Canada is which one of these do we have? So we know we're deficit spending now. We know we're accumulating debt, but what happens when times are good?